Welcome to the Indian Nations Conservation Alliance podcast, where Native voices lead the conversation on conservation, stewardship, and our responsibilities to the lands and waters that sustain us. Across Indian country, our homelands carry stories of relationship, resilience, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who live with the land and listen to what it teaches. Through conversations with tribal producers, ranchers, conservation leaders, elders, and community partners, we share the teachings and experience that continue to guide how we care for the water, the land, and the living systems that surround us. Together across Indian country, we recognize the spirit carried in our waters, our homelands, and our ecosystems, and we honor our role as caretakers for those yet to come. We are honored to welcome our knowledge keeper, Gheri Hall, who brings a deep insight into the relationship between ecology, culture, and preservation on the Blackfeet homelands. Okay, Gheri, could you share a bit about yourself, your lineage, and the journey that has shaped your path as a knowledge keeper?
Sure. Okay, my name is Gheri Hall. I work with the Blackfeet Tribal Historic Preservation Office here in Browning. And one way that my lineage or my journey has been shaped as a knowledge keeper was, typically growing up, my family was never part of any traditional teachings or had the insight or knowledge that we have today. And so basically, I'm the first one in my family that has began the traditional pathways and helped bring on the rest of my family into this traditional way of life. And so the basic journey that I have that shaped me here as a knowledge keeper began when I was really young. I was high school and I had some trauma in my family that I had reached out to a ceremonial elder to see what certain dreams were going on, just sort of help in any way that they can. They had guided me to the Horn Society up in Canada, and that typically was the beginning of my path. It had been maybe 5 years after the point of first getting involved into the ceremonial life that my partner and I at the time were asked about obtaining a beaver bundle and being the keeper of one of the older society bundles here on the reservation. And so that basically was the beginning of my journey. And mainly I was considered one of the younger people who have ever had these bundle these ceremonial rites. I was 20 years old when I had taken on the path of a traditional beaver bundle keeper. Most times you see older people taking this path, but I was chosen for a certain reason, and later on in my journey, it finally unraveled the reason why I was here. And I think a big part of it was just being able to get my family included into the traditional journey and including them into our way of life. I think that was one of the reasons why my journey began so young.
Awesome. No, that's a lot to take in. Your lineage. You started without a foundational cultural background, and you kind of found your way into our traditional ecological knowledges by taking a beaver bundle and taking a joining our sacred societies.
Right.
Yeah, right. What is your do you have a native name, and is there a story about how you received it?
Sure. So my name is Isamikisumaki, that is longtime moon woman. The late George and Molly were the ones who, Kicking Woman, George and Molly Kicking Woman were the ones who gave me that name. And that had started out during my path as finding where I stood in my life, in my world. That was basically, I had reached out to the family of John and Carol Murray, and they had invited me to a ceremony that was taking place at their house during that time. They had asked if I had an Indian name, and they had gotten everything set up prior to that, so I was able to receive the Indian name. Um, and at the time when my name was given, of course, Molly and George had sat and sort of conversed a little bit about it and had asked about who my family was and where they come from, and just a history of my grandmothers, and so I had told them the story about initially how one of our Hall namesakes had traveled um, for months on end on a cattle drive up to Montana, and also how I always felt connected to the outside world, specifically at nighttime and looking at the stars and the moon. And so I think the longtime moon woman was just a name that they had chosen based on some conversations they held within themselves. And so, uh, it's just something that has stuck with me my whole entire life. So I think it fits me good. I think there's a good part of the history of my family and just things that I was interested in that serve as a purpose of why my name is that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. You name drop some heavy hitting elders, sort of knowledge keepers that we have in our community. John Murray, the Swims Unders, or Mike and Molly, is that right?
Hmm.
Right. Yeah, no, those very they kept our culture intact, when things were outlawed very much. That's
Right.
really, really important, I think, that your first name. Um, how is the Tribal Historical Preservation Office, the THPO office here, working to incorporate TEK into its practices?
So for the most part, what our office does is a lot of site protection, and so let me kind of recap what our office does. Basically, whenever there's any ground disturbances on the reservation, our office is the first one dispatched to go out and do an initial survey of the area to make sure that they're not destroying any of our cultural sites. So of course, site protection of the teepee rings. We have the Buffalo Driveline cairns, the Buffalo Jumps themselves. We have fasting sites. We have places where people go out and seek their personal visions or personal power quests that all encompasses into the site protection of our office. And so, with the cultural resource surveys that we do, we don't just take in consideration of the sites themselves, but we include the land. So we're looking at the plants, the traditional and medicinal plants that are here on the reservation. We incorporate animals, and so we look at if there are any animal migration routes that might be disturbed. We look at the grass and the ecological and conservation views, and to make sure that the grass can withhold any sort of changes in the area. One of our bigger concerns is the waterways. We want to make sure that our water stays protected. We have some of the most purest water here in the United States, coming from the Triple Divide, and so a lot of our water gets divided out and travels as far as to the oceans. And so being that we are the first in line of this water, making sure that our water is protected and clean is a big effort that we do, other than protecting the sacred places that are here. Uh, Another way that we provide our in our cultural resource surveys, we also branch out and we do elder interviews, and we incorporate oral stories and oral history into these stories. And so one of the most recent reasons that we had started to do this is when our Badger 2 medicine was under the threat of having oil leases placed into the area. We had worked with archaeologists who incorporated our oral histories and oral stories into those reports, making them a tangible object, which then was able to have teeth and stand up in a court of law, which eventually helped get the remaining oil leases canceled in the Badger 2 medicine.
Wow.
So that's something really big that our office likes to incorporate. Other than that, you look at the repatriation. There's a ton of our objects that have been taken by museums and libraries, and not only our traditional artifacts, but we also have human remains. Our ancient ancestors reside in some of these libraries and schools, and so it falls upon our office to start the process of getting some of these items returned. And then we pair that with our education and our public interpretation to the schools. So we typically travel around and do presentations at schools, and we start enticing some of these younger kids at a young age to start the idea of preservation and uh, repatriation. So other than that, we do a lot of signage around a reservation for the people who are just coming into the reservation. For instance, the 3 million visitors that we get during Glacier National Park, we want to have them acknowledge that the land that they're on, and to be able to read these signs that are placed around the Blackfeet Reservation.
Right, right. Well, that's a lot to encapsulate. You guys do a lot here at the Tribal Historical Preservation Office. It sounds like you guys work with the entire ecosystem surrounding, you know, Blackfeet country and Blackfeet culture and everything that comes with an ecosystem. Why do you think it's important that preservation work be guided by both cultural teachings and ecological knowledge?
I think for the most part, like Western science really views the land through data points, and so like the land, the soil, the water, those all come out as material or data points, and so cultural teachings add a spiritual and historical
Yes.
context to these layers. The TEK identifies why a site is important to our tribe, basically. And encompasses the traditional stories and teachings that are not always visible to the public, or if it's limited to be able to be seen in a tangible way. And so a lot of these cultural teachings pass down and preserve our protocols on how we interact with the land and the people and the animals and the water, and just the importance of each of the items that we set out to preserve. Another thing is our sovereignty and our self determination
Right.
for the tribe is another big push. We like to be able to push our sovereignty and our self determination, and determining what these sites interpreted as. A lot of times in the past, you had people coming in on reservations, non-native archaeologists who would see something and not know the depth of it, or interpret a site completely different than what it is, or not have any idea at all. Um, so I think that traditional eco knowledge really helps us prevent any site damage and overcrowding of areas, and just not allowing a lot of commercialization to come about on and destroying our sites. Um, and so they just basically ensure our preservation, and that living with our relationships with the land and the animals and the water all stays intact with our traditional way of life.
Right, right. You you touched on the Badger 2 medicine leases being canceled. Um, so that goes right in line with this next question I have for you. Have there been moments where traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, has shifted or deepened how preservation decisions are made?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Well, when you look at how in the past, the state or the federal agencies were the one making the call on everything. They were the ones that were able to come in and determine everything. The TEK has really put a spin on the tribal nations' interpretation of ways of doing things. And so, so I think with that sense, with the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, I think that really put a spin on how preservation is looked at, and how just how we shifted into a different era of where the tribal decision and the tribal stories are actually something that is more than just being framed as folklore or mythical, or ways that they had undermined our oral stories in the past. And so I think by them being included into these reports, and being able to just see that they're actual tangible things. Another thing that we like to look at is there was a term coined, landscape engineers. And so recently we look at our oral stories, and we're able to provide the scientific framework and research that backs up these stories. Like, we have the story of the Napi and the Rolling Rocks, where, in a paraphrase, Napi had put his robe on rocks, and because of the heat in the summertime, and he had went back and took it back from the rocks, and the rocks were upset and started chasing him. And in the story, he runs for a long time. Well, we have rocks here on the reservation that have jasper in them. They're rocks that consist of jasper, which doesn't have any jasper rocks. The only other rocks that I've found that have that same consistency and material source is made way up in the northern part of Canada. So that coincides with the idea that that Napi and the Rolling Rocks did take place. We look at the engineering of our mountains, for say, that talk about how Napi had waved his hand and molded the mountains to keep the buffalo over on our side. We have kettle lakes that are formed by some of the steps that he takes. And so, just being able to include all of our historical and oral traditions into these reports really put a spin on how the state and federal agencies can decide on certain sites and certain limitations, and exactly how the preservation is made.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved how you tied the our ancient stories, Blackfeet ancient stories, and we're actually we're tying that TEK with that Western ideology, and really making the bridge and proving our stories true, or proving the stories true. Leads into my next question really well. Is there a teaching or a story you'd like to share that reflects the responsibilities we carry as caretakers of the land, and caretakers of the culture?
I think for the most part, one of the teachings that we live by here at this office is that that land is seen as a living relative, that it has, you have to take into consideration the overgrazing and the water levels and everything in that nature as we look at it. And so respecting the land is kind of one of the bigger issues that we want to stress for our younger people. And no overuse, no overgrazing. Another teaching that we also like to encompass is listening to our elders and getting our ceremonial people their voices heard. There's a ton of information and knowledge that each elder has, and so just getting the time to sit down with these people and sort of pick their brain into certain stories. You'd be amazed at how much information one single elder has. And so, and that sort of just leads into honoring our sacred spaces, living with the future in mind. And so basically everything that we do here at the office, we have the idea of our children that are in mind, our generations that are going to come after us, and be able to keep using the area the same way that our ancestors had in the past. And so when we look at preserving some of these sites, a lot of times we don't make our ceremonial or our sacred sites public knowledge. We typically store that in our tribal database here at the THPO office, which we don't share with the state, we don't share with anybody, and so a lot of times when people come into the area and they're conducting some sort of project, they'll say they checked with the State Historic Preservation Office and there isn't any sites that are listed. And so we have to set them down and let them know that, no, we have certain sites here. But I think as the caretakers of this land is just something that we highly value in our work, and we just want to make sure that the land stays as it is, and just keep in mind the future generations that come down the road.
Right. Yeah. No, that's actually a really powerful um planting seeds today to probably for trees that we'll never see, just so that our future generations will have that oxygen to breathe. It's really, really important. That's pretty much all the questions I have for you. Do you have anything that you just wanted to share on your own? Anything with TEK?
Yeah, I think something that we recently started this year, is we started collecting a lot of our plants and our traditional medicines, and so we've started writing down certain plants. We get a picture of them. We have a picture of their roots and some of the traditional and medicinal ways that we had used them. And so I think the information that we gather here at the office just isn't based on Blackfeet can use this. I want to stress that we feel that we have something for all of mankind to learn. And so, if there's ever a need for people to know what some of this medicinal plants are used for, we certainly wouldn't withhold that information from anybody. We're in the process of getting our records and everything digitized, and so hopefully we should have some of this stuff listed on our website, which would be free for the public to look at and use for their own use.
Right, right. Creating that reciprocity, just so people have access to that knowledge that ain't privileged to it. I think is really important too. That's very powerful. Um, you talked about traditional ecological knowledge, and one of the things that I want to emphasize is that when we talk about TEK as a whole, we represent ourselves with our brothers and sisters throughout the country with indigenous knowledges. And then when we zoom in, we talk about our landscapes and our place-based systems that surround majority of our reservations, and kind of bring it in from that TEK to BEK, like Blackfeet ecological knowledge, and understanding our surroundings and our. I think it's really important for us, to apply these teachings in our own lives and our own work, and understanding the relationality when we talk about preservation, ecology and community. And I really want to give a big shout out to Gheri, Miss Hall here, for taking the time to sit with us and talk about just that preservation, that ecology, that community, and what traditional ecological knowledge looks like in Western diaphragms, and how we can take that TEK and spread it throughout these systems that ain't designed for us as Indigenous folks.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you, Gheri. I really appreciated your sit down, and thanks for being a part of the this interview podcast.
Certainly. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Listening to the Inca podcast. This program is supported through grant funding from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Rural Climate Smart Initiative, and the Indigenous Grazing Lands Coalition. These efforts help support grassroots producers, tribal ranchers, and the conservation partners working to strengthen stewardship across Indian country as a whole. The views expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA. To learn more about Inca and our work, visit us online and join us for the next conversation. Thank you.